letter to the Thessalonians really in a lot of interest in you guys. This is the letter that was sent by Paul to the Thessalonians with one issue at hand, and that issue was the fake news was propagated around using his name that the day of the Lord had arrived. What is the day of the Lord? Judgment Day. You want to really understand the day of the Lord, then study 2 Thessalonians as well as the 1 Thessalonians. You will know that Paul uses the word the day of the Lord, the term the day of the Lord a lot. And that has a lot to do with the judgment day. Then he speaks about the fact that don't worry, the judgment day is not here yet until apostasy happens and the man of lawlessness is revealed. So now we want to end the 2 Thessalonians because that's how Paul ends it. He never tells who is the man of lawlessness. He didn't say it's Romans or anybody at that. But he ends his letter by giving advice to the Thessalonians, how they're going to live their lives. Just as much as we're looking forward to the coming of Jesus, the second coming of Jesus, but yet we are still on this earth. So we need to also know how to live our lives while we wait for his coming. So here, we'll finish off chapter 3. It was supposed to be done previous week. I will now pass it to Timmy, and Timmy has the summary of 2 Thessalonians chapter 3.
And we have 4 questions to answer. The first question was, what was Paul's prayer request? Paul had asked the Thessalonian church who have accepted Christ to pray for the Lord's message to spread rapidly and be honored wherever it goes, just as when it came to them. Not only that, he also asked to be prayed for his rescue from wicked and evil people, because not everyone is a believer or true believer. Who were the Christians told to keep away from, and why? The Christians who were told to keep away from are believers who live idle lives and don't follow the tradition that they received from Paul, which he expected them to imitate. Why? Because Paul was not idle when he was with them. He worked hard day and night so that he doesn't have to burden anyone. Also, although he had the rights to ask them to feed him, he did not ask because he wanted to give them a good example to follow. Paul was basically telling the Thessalonians to use him as his model, to follow his ways instead of living idle lives. As we pulled up the Strong Concordance to find out what is the meaning of idle or idleness, it says here in Greek, ataktos, it means disorderly manner. That means people who live disorderly and insubordinate to God's word, meaning they are unfruitful, they are unproductive, and they lack discipline. Paul must be upset because he expressed that he still hears of some living idle lives, refusing to work and meddling in other people's business. Not only were they idle, but some of them had too much free time going around house to house, gossiping and busybodying around, telling things what they should not. They could have assumed the rights to be served or provided with needs like free food or other necessities, or because they thought they deserved such privileges as church members. And they must have turned to a bunch of irritants who caused disunity and discord, and this affected the morale and harmony of the church. Paul wanted them to stop all that and settle down, as in live an orderly life and earn their own living. How were they to treat those who did not obey Paul's instructions? Those who did not obey Paul's instructions, even after having to advise and remind them again for the second time around, they were told to stay away from them so they will be ashamed, that they might change and realize what they are doing when no one's talking to them or associating with them. But Paul reminded that they should not be treated like enemies, but instead warn them like how a brother or sister would. Paul had to implement church discipline in cases where there is disobedience to God's commands. Paul confirmed himself as the writer of this letter by admitting that it is he who wrote in his own handwriting and that he does the same to all his letters to prove that it was from him.
Yeah, so that was the last advice from Paul to the Thessalonians. in 2 Thessalonians. And he didn't talk so much about the man of lawlessness anymore. He just told these guys, hey, look, you have to continue to work. Those that don't work, stay away from them. He rebuked those that refuse to work and cause problems in the church. But don't ostracize them. Stay away from them, but rebuke them. They're still your brothers. So he ends that and he says, hey, look, peace be with you. Now we are going to focus on the city of Corinth and the church of Corinth. And does Corinth exist today? Corinth does exist today. It is a pretty modern city. Ancient Corinth is still there. The excavation site is still there. You can visit it. Now, Corinth was a very important city-state at that time. If you had looked at the map, it is actually on a very narrow peninsula strait. It has two important harbors or ports, Lycaon and Charis. To that point in time, it was a pretty important city. The patron god of Corinth, Poseidon, and the god of the sea, or the lord of the sea. So that was their patron god. Corinth had very diverse multicultural population. It comprised of Greeks, Italian Jews, and the population was mainly athletes, philosophers, merchants, and artists. Remember this, because later we're going to talk about that. So it was educated, very artistic city. Today, Corinth is still there, 30,000 in it. Ancient Corinth was burned down by the Romans. They rebuilt it. So today, Corinth, about 30,000, small city only, but nevertheless, a very pretty city. And how do we find out what Paul did in Corinth? Acts chapter 18 to be precise. So now I'm going to give you a quiz. Who did Paul meet in Corinth? All right. It is Aquila and Priscilla. Aquila and Priscilla are Italian Jews that were chased out of Rome. Remember, it is all there in Acts. So when you align Acts with the letters of Paul, it becomes even more interesting. Okay, good answer. How long did Paul stay in Corinth? He stayed there a year and a half. So it was not too long, but not too short either. He had to spend quite a lot of time building the church there, together with Aquila, Priscilla, who were his trade and ministry partners. When the Jews couldn't get Gallio, the governor, to convict, you see that everywhere he went, there were Jews that were jealous, that didn't agree with him, that wanted to beat him up or wanted to convict him. So they brought him to Gallio, who was governor, to convict. But Gallio didn't want to mess his hands with them. In turn, who did they beat? That is Sosthenes or Sosthenes. I think in Greek they call Sosthenes. Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue. Remember this name because this name is going to come back up again. Who was in Corinth when Paul traveled through the interior? Meaning that after Paul left Corinth, went and traveled to the interior, who was ministering in Corinth? Apollos. Remember this name as well because Apollos is going to come up when we go into the letter of this is second missionary journey. So he travels all the way from Antioch of Syria, not Antioch of Pisidia, Antioch of Syria, goes to Thessalonica, Berea, and then he ends up in Corinth. Spent 1.5 years in Corinth with Aquila, Priscilla, and then he decided it's time for me to go. So where did he go? He brought Aquila, Priscilla to Ephesus. See Ephesus somewhere in the center? You remember Ephesus already? The amphitheater. But this time when he went, he just left Aquila and Priscilla. He didn't stay very long. He just stayed a couple of days or maybe a week or so. And then he says, no, I have to go, but I'll be back. I'll be back, he says. Right? So he's left Aquila, Priscilla, and he sailed back down to Caesarea, which you remember, Caesarea Cornelius. Then he pays a short visit in Jerusalem to the elders, pay homage to the elders, and then he goes north up back to Antioch. That's the end of his second missionary journey. Then he starts his third missionary journey. This is Paul. This is Paul's life. He was so excited. He's so passionate about his ministry. Now he wants to go back again. So he starts off in the inland. From Antioch, he goes left to the inland, which he didn't go earlier. Went inland, and remember just now, when he went inland, who went to Corinth? Apollos. Remember the name Apollos. So he went there and he ended up in Ephesus. And what happened in Ephesus? Remember, he went to the synagogue. He wanted to preach to the Jews. The Jews chased him out. He rented the hall of, anybody can give me the answer? The hall of?
Tyrannus.
Tyrannus. Very good. The hall of Tyrannus, and he preached and he taught there for 2 years. He had to deal with Demetrius, remember, because the city of Ephesus was the city of Diana. While Paul was in Ephesus, this is about maybe a year or more after he left Corinth, he gets letters, he received letters telling about what is happening to the church in Corinth. Problems in the Corinthian church. And there are many problems. That's why he has to write a very, very long letter, and he writes it from Ephesus. Okay, so 1 Corinthians 16 chapters, very long letter because many problems in the Corinthian church that Paul has to address. About what are the problems in Corinth, the church of Corinth?
The Corinthians were intellectuals, they're very smart people, and they have their own rich culture, and which they took pride in. And they spoke very well and had high knowledge. However, Paul noted that there was disunity within the church, and he appealed for the Corinthians to unite the church. He emphasized that their conviction to the centrality and importance of the gospel message as a key to church unity. Christ crucified, the centrality of that. And therefore, Christ is the one to whom honor is due. Paul emphasized that he never took any credit for the few baptisms he performed. He focused on preaching the gospel of Jesus, which was his God-given mission. And he never did so for clever means. The power of the message of the cross of Christ. The Jews always perceived a crucified Christ, a crucified Messiah, as a weakness, as a false Christ. Whereas the Gentile Greeks' mindset perceived the cross as foolish and opposed to their conception for what a deity should be like. Paul proclaims and reminded faithful Corinthians, not persuasive words, but by the power as demonstrated by the saving power of the Holy Spirit. The Greek word Sophia is pronounced, in English it's Sophia, but in Greek it's pronounced as Sophia, and it translates as wisdom. Now, this Greek noun Sophia means wisdom, intelligence, or knowledge. But this intelligence and knowledge pertain more to a skill in living than to attainment of facts. So it's not an intellectual wisdom, but rather it is to one who looks to God for instruction. Solomon stated that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, from Proverbs 1:7, which implies that even a genius who does not fear God is a fool. He also expounded on spiritual wisdom, that God's supernatural wisdom is understood by those enabled to see through the Spirit's illumination.
Chapter 1 and chapter 2, thanks David, there's an issue. And what is that issue? What is the problem?
There was division in Corinth.
That's right. That's division. Okay, that main thing is a simple problem. There's a simple answer is division. There was division in the church. And what was the division about? That some people say that they are Paul's supporter. Some people say they are Apollos supporter. Some say they are Cephas or Peter's follower. And some say they are Christ's follower. And what was the issue at hand? You hear him talk a lot about wisdom. The issue at hand was a conflict or the competition of who is wiser and who is smarter. The problem of the division was that there are some gangs that are saying that they are smarter, and they are at the later part of the chapters, you realize that they say that they are smarter than Paul. Because you try to outdo each other in terms of wisdom and knowledge and understanding. Just to let you see, it is called P46. It's an actual manuscript of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 14 to chapter 2, verse 2. They really preserve all these artifacts very well. This manuscript dated 2nd century. Means actually it's not very long after Paul. Paul wrote this 53 AD. So this is like maybe 40, 50 years after that, where the scribes continued to write the manuscript. So this is a very well-preserved papyrus. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and a little bit of chapter 2. Let's look at the verses because David had shown quite a lot of verses already. So he's trying to say this, right? He's saying that those people that accept Christ, they are seen foolish. Those people that don't accept Christ, did you realize that in this world, the smart ones, the intelligent ones, the professors, the scientists and all that, they are non-believers, most of them. They are non-believers in simple gospel. Since it doesn't make sense to them. It doesn't make sense because worldly wisdom is rooted in philosophies. Whereas this is a very simple act of Jesus Christ to die on the cross and his resurrection. That's why they couldn't believe it. This very interesting verse, I want you to look at this verse, is 118. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. Do you understand this verse? This is exactly what Pastor was teaching us last week about literary forms. And I really like 1 Corinthians because of the way Paul writes. And maybe it's not him, maybe it's Sosthenes, because in the greeting, Sosthenes appears. You know, Sosthenes was the guy who was beaten up, the leader of the synagogue. Is partly the author, or maybe he was just a scribe. But Paul writes in such a beautiful literary form in 1 Corinthians. And you will understand, because just now we said, and David also mentioned, Corinth is a melting pot of art, of creativity, of culture. So what literary form is this? Last week you pastors taught you guys about prose and poetry. Poetry would be more flowery. This is what they call parallelism. Hebrew poetry, there's a lot of parallelism. They use a lot of parallelism. That means one statement, and you go to Proverbs, you go to Psalm, it's there. Actually, more than half of the Bible is poetry and a lot of all these rhymes. So Paul is very good. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. So you can see opposites here. This is called antithetic parallelism. Wow, very big words, right? It is using one opposite of the other, foolishness and wisdom. He always talks about foolishness and wisdom, that's all. Those who think they are wise, they are actually foolish. Those who think they are foolish, they are actually wise. Why is he writing like that? Because he's writing to the Corinthians, not to Malaysians like us, right? So the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are unbelieving, but to us, being saved, it is the power of God. So is he talking about wisdom? Do we need wisdom to accept the gospel or not? Do we need wisdom? Do we need so-called human wisdom to understand? So he says, for the Jews require a sign. That's why they never believe. Actually, the sign that they wanted was the king coming to rescue them, but they never saw it. They saw the king coming to die on the cross. They couldn't accept it. And the Greeks were seeking after wisdom. But what has a carpenter got to give them wisdom? They were looking for a philosopher. They were looking for a teacher, a learned man. But Paul says, we are the ones that preach Christ crucified. Don't look for leadership in the church of people who are wise, who are eloquent, who are knowledgeable, and think that they are, follow them and all that. Unless they're preaching Christ crucified, yes, then you believe them. If you are preaching some other motivational sermons, like motivation, all this, then you need to rethink. Are they really preaching Christ crucified or not? So here is Paul saying that there are people in the church that are basically showing off their wisdom, showing off their knowledge. I'm so good in Hebrew. I'm a Greek scholar. I'm a Hebrew scholar. He says that, no, we are all basically preaching Christ crucified. It's another antithetical parallelism. The foolishness of God is wiser than man. The weakness of God is stronger than man. Phew, beautiful, beautiful. For those of you who are aspiring to be songwriters, or like Val is taking an English degree and you're writing, this is one of the best ways. That makes Bibles more beautiful if you can appreciate this kind of writing. Really can appreciate, because you have gone to Bible study class with pastor, then you will understand literary forms, poetic forms, parallelisms. So this one is called the antithetic. Take one opposite to the other. Okay? So enjoy this journey of learning about literary forms, because 1 Corinthians is full of them. And I want to talk to everyone that is here today. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you became a Christian or when you accepted Christ. Were you rich? Were you famous? Were you of high position when you accepted Christ? Maybe some of us, but not all of us. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. So if you think you are weak and you think you are foolish, God can use you even more than the wise. That's why if you think you can't teach Bible, you think you can't preach, you think you can't do much in church, think again. Because you think you're foolish, but God can make you wise. You think you're weak, God can make you strong. All you have to do is to be willing to accept. And I, as a classic example, I never used to preach, I never used to teach. But one day, pastor come and tell me, I want you to teach. I want you to teach a big class. And I said, I seldom refuse pastors, honestly. In my whole life as a Christian, when a pastor comes to ask me to do something, I normally will say yes, and then I regret later. So, but I will always try to live up to their expectation and God's expectation, because I know that it is not me, it's God. Why God chooses the foolish? Because no man may boast before God. I cannot boast of my intelligence or my wisdom that I'm so good at teaching, because I'm foolish and only God can make me wise. Only God can give me the understanding. Only God can give me the wisdom to teach or to preach or to share the gospel. And at the end of the day, I must preach only Jesus and Him crucified. I tell you, brothers and sisters, the final objective is to preach Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Whether you're teaching Acts, whether you're teaching Revelation, whether you're teaching the book of Psalms or whatever it is, at the end of the day, the objective is to preach and to show Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That's all. So if you have that in mind, your Bible study materials will come into play.